So, welcome back, George.
Thank you. Thanks, Natalie.
We've got a lovely long stretch of time now to have a conversation, and we invite short comments as well as questions, because there may be, like George said, you know, hive mind. There may be things that you feel that you'd like to contribute or say. And I'm going to really try and include you up there, but it's very hard to remember you're there. So if I forget, just heckle me. Give me a shout, throw something. No, don't do that. So we're going to try and balance questions from everyone on the gender spectrum, so please feel included. And I think maybe we'll start off down here, somewhere along the front. Who's going to be brave and have the first question for us? Right here at the front. Yeah, a microphone is coming your way. Okay, super.
So you were talking about the way that we judge our self-worth on economic value. How do we shift our desire to create happiness through not buying needless things when in competition with everyone else who is doing it? Like, everyone else has got a smartphone. We don't need a smartphone. Yet if we're not partaking in that, we're like pariahs and disconnected from the rest of society. And that can affect our mental health as well. So I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
That's a lovely and profound question. Thank you. And probably like most of the questions I'll be asked tonight, there's no easy answer. You know, and I think, you know, the general answer to all the questions is going to be there's no easy answer. So I'll just mark that down in advance. I mean, one thing we have seen, and you know, it's been really thrilling over the past couple of years, is the development of new communities, new political communities, communities of thought, who are basically saying, yeah, this is bullshit. We're not going to succumb to the system that's been handed to us. This system doesn't work for us. It works for the oligarchs. It works for the corporations. It's not working for our well-being either now, in terms of our mental and social well-being, or in the future. And while it's clear that it's very hard to get through life without a smartphone, it's actually, if you live in the right place, quite easy to get through life without a car, and without a whole lot of things which others consider essential to their well-being. And there has been a rediscovery of that to some extent. And we're constantly struggling against the tide of consumerism, against the ideology of consumerism, in trying to carve out that space in which we say this space belongs to me. It does not belong to Apple, and it does not belong to Volkswagen, and it does not belong to Bill Gates. It belongs to me, and to me alone, or rather to me as part of a community which isn't governed by those forces. And that is a constant struggle. You know, it's not something you can just do once and then forget. It's something you have to reinforce almost every day. And I've been lucky enough at different times of my life to be surrounded by people who are consciously and actively trying not to be swept along in the main current, and to find our own currents. And I've come to realize that we all have, I think, a moral duty to see outside of our own culture. That doesn't mean we have to step right out of it. You can always keep one foot in it, but to not be entirely dominated and governed by the mainstream cultures that surround us. It's not just a duty to ourselves, but a duty to society and to our descendants as well. Because I think almost all mainstream cultures are now sweeping us down that stream towards disaster. So stepping outside of ourselves, stepping outside of our social circumstances, that's a duty.
Yeah, thanks. I felt one of the things that I picked up, George, with what you were saying that resonated and I think relates to your question as well, was you were talking about the sort of the old aspirations that were spiritually and community-based, or was a woman, who was the lady that you were referencing?
Yes, the woman that my father-in-law was billeted with as an evacuee during the Second World War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like, I mean, that is one of the things, like you're saying, that we've lost. But for me, I definitely feel like that is my saving grace, is having those sort of spiritual aspirations as well as my community aspirations. And I think the more we connect with faith, whatever that means to you, whether that's faith in nature or faith in a higher power or God or whatever, that actually the more interesting that becomes. And that doesn't cost anything, and it doesn't require any resources other than air. And
I think it's worth listing to ourselves what gives life meaning and purpose. And I'm sure everybody has their own list, but to me it would definitely include to love and be loved. I think that would probably come first. To seek enlightenment, whether it's spiritual or intellectual. And by spiritual, that can mean almost any direction that you want to take. I don't necessarily mean any formal religious direction. To learn and to teach and to create. Yeah. And most importantly, perhaps, to try to do good. And I guess also one more thing, to feel useful. I think we all need to feel useful, but to feel useful in that broader sense connected with doing good. That would be my list of where meaning and purpose lies.
It's a good list. Did you write that one down? I'd stop writing at that point.
And strangely enough, a better pair of sneakers does not feature on that list.
Yeah, try telling that to my 16-year-old. Thank you very much for that question. Let's take another one. I'd like to take one maybe from the lady in the pink jumper here in the middle. Can we just move this back a little bit?
Oh, sure, yeah. Yes, good plan.
Perfect, thank you.
I might turn this a bit so I've got the whole audience.
Right, can you hear me?
2 microphones.
Yes,
spoiled for choice.
Consumer aspiration.
Totally. I wanted to add to that something that I feel is missing. We value success, we value creativity. It's like creativity is the most fantastic thing. I mean, I'm myself guilty of telling my kids, oh, you're fantastically creative and so on. And of course, they go to school and they learn to be even more creative and more productive, etc., etc. But the one thing I feel is missing is caring.
Yes.
Caring for ourselves, for each other, caring for the world, for the natural world, and of course the environment, other living species, etc. And I just feel like we get so caught up, even in the beautiful creativity aspect of life and of being of service, etc., that I sometimes feel we're actually missing the most fundamental thing, which is, caring for what we already have, what's around us. That's just a comment.
Thank you.
Really.
No, that's an excellent point and beautifully put. And I think that's exactly right. And isn't it striking that the people taking power in so many nations now are those who don't seem to care about anyone but themselves? Tony Judt, in his book Ill Fares the Land, the great historian, pointed out that in the 50s and 60s, the highest aspiration of most of the graduates from the top universities was public service of one sort or another, either within government or within the liberal professions, but to basically sort of do something, not necessarily always for the right motives, but something which was deemed to improve the lot of society. And, obviously there was a very patrician culture, there was a lot wrong with it, there was a lot wrong with the conceptions of what doing good might be. But as a basic principle, it was absolutely fundamental. The idea was you established your value to yourself and to society by showing that you care, by doing public service. And he documented how that had completely shifted by the 1980s, where the greatest aspiration of graduates from the top universities was to make as much money as they could. or to seek power. And you know, I saw this as, you know, so many of the totally right-on students that I was with who had all been talking about smashing the system and going to work for Oxfam or being an artist or an artiste would just scurry into the city the moment the recruiters came around and get these very lucrative jobs. And what struck me is exactly what you said. My God, they don't care. How could this be? How could these people suddenly not care? And this sort of growing recognition, which I see as sort of part of my growing up, really, as part of my transition to adulthood, was this sort of deeply disturbing idea that actually people in positions of power, even if they once did care at certain times, maybe at the height of the Keynesian era, no longer seem to care. And of course, that's the one thing you can't persuade someone to do. You can persuade a prime minister or a president possibly to change their policy, but you can't persuade them to care if that's simply not part of their psychic makeup. If it's not there, it's not going to be there. And you know, we're constantly told, and this is an absolutely fundamental tenet of neoliberalism, that we are fundamentally selfish and greedy. The neoliberal philosophers have a Hobbesian view of humanity, that this is a war of all against all that we're engaged in. And our highest role in life is to be the dog which comes out top in the fight over the dustbin. And it's actually, it's not just horrible, but it's also untrue. There's now been a huge range of experimental work and research work in anthropology, in neuroscience, in social psychology, in cultural evolution, showing that while we all have some selfishness and greed inside us, those are not, in the majority of people, our dominant values. In the majority of people, our dominant values are caring values. It's about community, it's about family, it's about wanting the world in general to be good. These are the values which come out on top in the great majority of people. But in people who occupy positions of great power, those are not the dominant values. Selfishness and greed turn out to be the dominant values. So by and large, putting it rather crudely, we are a society of altruists governed by psychopaths.
Yeah.
How do we end up like this? And how do we, as the altruists, overthrow the psychopaths? That is one of the questions that confronts us.
Because it's an extraordinarily high percentage of CEOs are psychopaths. And then we see in the case of Donald Trump, who was a CEO, has come into government. So it is really interesting.
There's yes, at the session we did in Bristol before, someone asked a question about guilt. Should we feel guilty? And I said, you know, what do you call people who don't feel guilt? And several people shouted out psychopaths. Someone else shouted Tories, but possibly slightly unfairly. But there's it is. I mean, you're quite right. In fact, there's one line of that research which did sort of question and answers with a number of CEOs and found out that on certain measures of psychopathy, the rate among CEOs was higher, not just in the Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital as a whole, but in the division treating people with psychopathic disorders in Broadmoor Special Hospital.
Wow.
It was higher among CEOs. So that's not to say all CEOs are psychopaths, by any means, but it's to say that you get on in that world. Yeah. If you've got those tendencies. Yeah. And so there must be something profoundly wrong with a world that puts those people on top.
Or they're like you say, they don't care. They don't, they're not thinking about the impact on their fellow human beings or on the planet. So for that reason, they're pushing ahead and more competitive.
Well, if you think about the psychology of the corporation, the corporation, this is Joel Backen's very interesting work where he said, so if I was a psychiatrist and I was psychoanalyzing a corporation, what would I find? I would find that the corporation is a psychopath.
Right.
So even if everybody who works for it is not a psychopath, collectively the impact is psychopathic, effectively, because the corporation has a fiduciary duty to maximize the value of its shareholdings. And that is the bottom line. Everything else has to be bulldozed for that purpose. And so it can't care. There's a lovely quote in Steinbeck, again, actually. I don't know why I've got two quotes from Steinbeck tonight, but it's in The Grapes of Wrath where one of the characters say, I tell you, the bank is the monster. It can happen that everyone in a bank does not want the bank to do something and still the bank does it.
Yeah.
And so when people say, well, what about these CEOs? They must have grandchildren. They must care. We need to appeal to them. It's irrelevant. It's the structure which needs to change. And even if every one of those CEOs was angelic, it wouldn't make a difference.
It's so insidious, the desire for growth. Like you say, you kind of don't realise that you're in the ideology. So like City to Sea, it's a non-profit, but it's growing, and it's sort of, oh, well, now we're at 34 staff, and there's a thing about its growth. And obviously there's the thing around it having more impact. So the bigger we are, the more impact that we have. But I do catch myself and reflect that actually it's still seen as a business that's growing, and the pressure is for it to grow. And I know you've said something around, you know, if nature doesn't what was it you say about cancer and
well, yes, I'm not by no
as
means the first one to say it, but yes, the thing in nature which just keeps growing without stopping is the cancer cell, and nature tries to regulate growth. It tries to stop anything growing uncontrollably, but our entire political system really tries to stimulate uncontrollable growth or perpetual growth. The interesting what you say about the growth of NGOs, because the story is that the NGO gets bigger, it gets more powerful. My experience almost universally is that the bigger an NGO becomes, the more timid and conformist it becomes. The less prepared it is to challenge the system. And I see this in just about every field. It's really depressing to see. So even there, I would challenge the growth ethos.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for your question. I think it was a really important one, or your comment around care. And I think individually we can all kind of question how can we practice the art of care, and sort of, how are we caring for ourselves to begin with? Like, starting at home, are we being kind to ourselves and loving ourselves? And then are we doing that to our immediate family and our colleagues? And can we then practice extending that to our neighbours? And I think it's a really an active thing to practice. I just moved house recently, and I was invited to a WhatsApp group on my street. And I've never been invited to a WhatsApp group on my street. I love WhatsApp. Some people hate it. And within hours, there were people sharing resources, sharing drills, sharing ladders, sharing food, and it was just the most heartening thing. So, practice starting a WhatsApp group. Extend your circle of care. Let's take another question. So I think I'll move. I'm going to take one from the top, actually. I can see somebody waving their hands. There's somebody waving their hands at the front and then behind. So we'll go front, and then we'll come back to the woman, person behind. Thank you.
So, George, thank you. In October 2018, writing an article, which was the first time I heard about Extinction Rebellion. Thank you in October 2019 for being arrested on the streets of London.
Yes.
So when you wrote that article first, I was working in a pension company in the city, and now I'm a full-time volunteer for Extinction Rebellion. But October was a difficult second album for Extinction Rebellion. So my question tonight is, what thing or things should Extinction Rebellion be doing in 2020 that it wasn't doing in 2019?
Thank you. Another fantastic question. And one which, to be honest, I don't want to try to give a complete answer to, because Extinction Rebellion is a very democratic organisation, and these decisions must be made through its very democratic structures. So I'm always slightly wary of abusing my position of having a stage, literally having a platform, to say it should do this or it should do that. So all I can say is what I'm particularly interested in putting a focus onto, and anyone in Extinction Rebellion can think, well, that might be a good idea or that might not be a good idea, but I don't want to say I think Extinction Rebellion should be doing. So with that caveat...
Got that?
Yes. That's a disclaimer. I'm often, given that I work in the media, I'm often attacking fossil fuel companies and the rest of it, but constantly in the back of my mind is this thought that none of these destructive corporations or destructive oligarchs, and actually, the nature of capital has changed. It's shifted in focus from the corporation to the oligarch, and politics has changed to accommodate that. But none of these destructive forces could operate without the social license that the media gives them. And so if you were to ask me, what is the most destructive force, the oil companies or the media, without hesitation, I would say the media. If you were to ask me who is the most dangerous man on earth, without hesitation, I'd say Rupert Murdoch. In fact, I might have to qualify that because I asked on Twitter during the Australian fires when Murdoch's paper, The Australian, had on its front page two main stories, one of them celebrating rising coal exports and the other dissing the fire chiefs for calling for action on climate breakdown, right at the height of the Australian fires. And I asked on Twitter, I said, is there a more dangerous man on earth than Rupert Murdoch? And about 100 Australians replied, Lachlan Murdoch. So unfortunately, even when the old bastard shuffles off this mortal coil, the problem might not be over. So what we see the media constantly doing is providing the milieu within which destructive activity can continue. They provide the justifications, the ideological reinforcement. They normalize this totally bizarre and horrendous and abnormal situation where we are destroying our own life support systems. That becomes normalized every day by the media, not just by Murdoch's network, the Barclay brothers, the Viscount Rothermere. I mean, all these are offshore billionaires telling us how we should live in this country. They don't live in this country, but they demand us to show certain forms of patriotism which are entirely self-destructive. The cheek of it. But these people collectively are the most powerful people on earth because they are the gatekeepers of ideology. They are the people who structure the way that we see the world. So, with all the caveats I put forward, if it were entirely up to me, I would target the media.
Thank you.
So I might end up protesting against myself.
Yeah. Haven't The Guardian recently announced that they're going to stop doing fossil fuel adverts and aviation adverts now?
Yeah, the fossil fuel adverts. Finally, The Guardian has stopped taking fossil fuel adverts, which I'm really pleased about.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to see it go further.
Yeah.
I'd love to see us stop taking adverts altogether.
Yeah.
I would, along with the rest of the journalists, lose my job if we did. I mean, this is a great paradox, that I spend my life railing against consumerism and owe most of my living ultimately to adverts. Now, kindly, Facebook and Google and people are stealing the advertising revenue from us because they just take the content and get the adverts on it. Yeah. But maybe they're doing us a favour because, The Guardian is gradually moving to a voluntary subscription model, membership model, which seems to be working. And I would feel so much more comfortable working under those circumstances and ultimately being paid by advertising. Yeah. It's really a very disconcerting situation to be in. I think gradually we're proving that it can be done.
So when you keep swiping past that yellow box that pops up saying if you want to become a subscriber, you've read 30 articles this month. give it a go. Thank you for that question. I'd love to ask back to you. You know, what was it for you when you made? Have you still got the microphone? Could we ask for the microphone to just come back for a moment to the gentleman that asked the question? To go, that's a huge change to make from your full-time job in the city to then becoming a full-time volunteer for Extinction Rebellion. What was that moment? Was it seeing people out on the streets risking arrest? Was it the media attention? Was there something else? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so ultimately it's one of privilege, right? So white middle-class man, 30 years in the city, I had the privilege of giving up my job. So that was the first thing.
Great, thank you.
It was a paper by Jem Bendell, Deep Adaptation.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you look at what you're doing for 40 or 45 hours a week and you say, teaching young people who are, like my two children, 19 and 24, to save for the next 35 years when climate breakdown potentially jeopardizes civilized society in the next 10 years, just is ridiculous. So partly out of privilege, I suddenly looked at what I was going to spend the next 5 or 10 years doing, and I said, I won't be able to look at my children in the face in 10, 15, 20 years' time if I don't make this decision. So ultimately, that was it for me.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked. What better way to use your privilege? How many people have read Jem Bendell's paper on deep adaptation? Can I see? Quite a high percentage. Good. Thank you. Okay, I think we'll take another question from down here, and then we'll come back up to the person. Let's see. Could we go over here, the person at the back against the wall? Thank you. Sorry, we're just finding the path of least resistance for the microphone. Thank you, Charlie, for passing the microphone around.
Hi. As a member of the media, how do you think is the best way to sort of fight them, as you suggested earlier? They seem quite an impenetrable group to sort of change, and obviously there's things like news values and stuff like that you have to take into account. So how do you think it's best to sort of tackle that issue?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, they certainly can't be reformed from within. There is an imperative, which is that the proprietors' views should be accommodated. The proprietors, by definition, have to be either multi-millionaires or billionaires, otherwise you can't own a media empire. Media empires are very expensive. And generally what billionaires want is very different to what society needs. And so the idea that I can go there and reform it from within, it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen at all. Now, my great hope for social media was that we could dispense with the mainstream media, that we wouldn't need it anymore. But of course, we've seen social media becoming completely corrupted as well. And isn't it just extraordinary that Facebook is either unwilling or unable to get its house in order and stop showing completely misleading, lying political ads? It's just an extraordinary thing. And it's so dysfunctional that I think it must be deliberate. And when you think that a major shareholder in Facebook is Peter Thiel, who's a massive Trump fan, wrote a paper saying that there is an inherent clash between capitalism and democracy. He's absolutely right, by the way, but that it should be resolved in favor of capitalism. You begin to think, well, maybe it's not just innocent incompetence, but actually they don't want to sort this out. They're happy to be manipulated, and they're happy to be used by demagogues to lie. And so, I mean, we are seeing some fantastic alternative outlets developing, and there have been some now for 20 years or so, and some of them are getting better and better, and we see new initiatives, whether it's The Intercept or Mongabay News or whatever it might be, filling in some of the gaps that the mainstream media has left. And I think actually building on that is really our best hope. I don't think there's... I mean, I think one thing we have to do is to identify the issue. To say, you know, these are not just people showing the world to us as it is. These are people creating a world in their own image. That's what these media organizations are doing. So by protesting against them, by highlighting what they're doing, that in itself is something useful. You know, getting people to understand the ideological frame which has been placed around the world is an absolute critical part of all campaigns. But then, of course, creating powerful, viable alternatives, that too is really important. But one thing we keep coming up against, and you know, I keep bumping into this, is that ad hoc protests are not a long-term match for institutional power. That, you know, we come and go, and our protests are fantastic. We're highly effective. We're brilliant. We see some amazing people sacrificing their careers, changing their lives, and the rest of it. And this is absolutely crucial. But on the other side, we see people, whether they're in the media or in the think tanks, they should really be called corporate-funded lobby groups, whether they're in government departments, whatever, who are paid to be there day in, day out. They have entire career structures based on lying to us, based on changing society to suit the interests of billionaires. And it's that institutional power that we're up against. And one of our tasks, one of our many tasks, I'm afraid, is to work out how we confront institutional power, how we have the same staying power as the people that we're confronting. Otherwise, we break against that wall. And that's the constant danger we face, that we have this fantastic rising tide of a brilliant protest movement. And it rises, it peaks like a wave against the seawall, and then it recedes, and the seawall is still there. So what do we do to confront that institutional power? I don't have a complete or satisfactory set of answers, though there are some clues.
Thank you. I think we definitely see within Extinction Rebellion the importance of regeneration, and I think I've seen that more within XR than I have Occupy, or it seems to be sort of as important as the action is the regeneration. So I wonder, you know, I hope that perhaps that will give movements like Extinction Rebellion a bit more staying power, but it's a really important thing for us to be aware of. What other examples of positive media and alternatives? You mentioned The Intercept. Is it DDB? What's the one that you've...
DDN, Double Down News.
The Double Down News.
I love Double Down News. I've done a lot of stuff with them. It's, believe it or not, it's just two people who are now working full-time in it, but they've had incredible success in bringing forward voices and ideas and perspectives which just are not being represented at all on mainstream broadcasting. You know, some of it's in print, you know, The Guardian and elsewhere, but in broadcasting you're just not getting it. And some of the videos we've made, you know, have had millions of views. They've been really successful, and they're just very, very good filmmakers. Double Down News. So no, I love them. I've also worked with Sustainable Human, which is another very small filmmaking group based in San Francisco. The lovely thing nowadays, it doesn't matter where you are, you can make your video remotely, and we've also had great success with those, particularly on ecological issues, which are so poorly represented in broadcasting. I mean, there's a great proliferation of fantastic new outlets, and we should celebrate and support them. And I think actually, really, you know, people often ask, what campaign should I give my money to? And, you know, there's a million answers. But one of them, which we often forget about, are alternative media, because that's an absolutely crucial part of the ecosystem of new thought and action.
In Bristol, we've got the Cable, which again is
Yes,
funded
Bristol
through
Cable.
the
It's fantastic.
subscription method. I know I've heard of Campfire Convention is like hoping to be like a new form of. There was a clap there, wasn't there? Yay! A new form of Facebook, which is actually about creating community and beacons around the UK. Obviously, sort of positive news, but then telly as well. I mean, we're starting to see shifts. I've noticed shifts. There was the Liz Bonin programme on Meat that was on BBC One at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night.
Amazing,
what was it called? Meat, the Dirty Truth or something. But it was a great programme.
A threat to our planet. Meat, a threat
to our planet.
Yeah,
and then, of course, Apocalypse Cow.
It's taken me 30 years to get a serious documentary on a mainstream broadcast channel.
Well done for going the distance. Talk about sort of having the energy to front up against
it wasn't extraordinary. I mean, I was literally, excuse the Anglo-Saxon, I was literally told to fuck off by a series of commissioning editors and channel controllers over the course of 30 years, where you would work for months on a program proposal, and it was really, really good. And they would look at it and say, is this environment? And you'd say, yes. Oh, fuck off.
Yeah.
It's just extraordinary. Yeah. That's how they behaved. It is now changing.
Now it's zeitgeist. It's trendy.
Well, what happened was they said, these young people we're trying to reach, they're really interested in this environment thing. Yeah. But unfortunately, we've sacked anyone who knows anything about it. Do you know anything about it? That's how it's got to. So anyway, better late than never.
But it's good. It's good to see that kind of thing going through. And the fact that we've got now the shareability of it afterwards is it has a life beyond the 9 o'clock slot or whatever, so we can share it. So, well done for that. Okay. So I'm going to come over here and take a question. Perhaps the person there just next to the stairs? And then we'll come back up to you at the top. I've not forgotten about you.
Ignoring electoral issues like first past the post, how can the Labour Party or any party effectively combat the ideology of conservatism, which is based on pragmatism, that is, response to social change?
Thank you. Another great question. These are all fantastic questions, and I do feel, just to say, I've been doing these talks for 35 years now, one way or another. And the questions just get better and better. There is a sense of people looking very seriously at the world. So thank you all.
Well done.
Thanks. But, I mean, obviously everything is wrong with our system, starting with the electoral structures, the political structures, the funding system. But, and there is, one fear which constantly crosses my mind is, will we ever get a change of government? And I think some people are asking this question now in the US, because there is, following up on this point about institutional power, it does seem to me that there's a sort of global movement of conservatism and the far right, indeed, and the two are meshing now, which seems to have almost found a formula for winning, which involves extravagant lies on social media, a lot of cheating, massive funding, and just sort of touching a few very crude and obvious buttons which seem at the moment to work. And confronting this is always an uphill struggle. As someone pointed out, the Conservatives are always operating in easy mode because they've got the media behind them. They're going with the main ideological flow, whereas if you're trying to confront that and get a radical change of government, then you're turning against that flow, and you're always going to be struggling against it. But there are things that we can do, but we have to take this systematic approach. And one of the things which has been so lacking from political movements has been the idea of rigorous and effective self-education. This used to be absolutely crucial to labour movements here and in the rest of the world. The Workers' Education Association absolutely an essential part of the labour movement, as indeed were some of the community organisations, such as the Clarendon Clubs, all been forgotten. The idea now is that politics is just politics. Politics is always so much more than politics. Politics is so much about knowledge, about education. But, you know, again, talking about how our aspirations have changed, you know, one of the great aspirations, going back 80, 100 years, was self-education. The thing that people wanted to acquire, more even than material goods, was knowledge. And we have to rediscover that. That is absolutely essential. We have to turn that back into a social aspiration. And one acquires no useful knowledge in any subject without determined study. You're not going to get it by randomly looking online, by randomly watching YouTube videos and following Twitter feeds and stuff like that. You actually have to focus on it. And of course, part of the effort of the media and of social media is to distract us, is to prevent us from pursuing that determined study. And as a component of that determined study, I think we as social movements need to help develop the tools which enable people to spot fake news. Some of you may be aware of the very interesting stuff that's going on in Finland. You know, there's now a 34-year-old prime minister in Finland who's fantastic. She is one of the 4 female political leaders in Finland who together have formed a coalition government. All female run. Really very exciting. And it just looks so different and feels so different from most other governments. Now, how did they get there? Well, a really important part of it was that since 2014, Finland has had a universal program for helping people to understand social media and to spot fake news. Mm. And so people aren't getting fooled by demagogues in the way that we are in so many other countries. They aren't getting conned by these charlatans who are able to lie so extravagantly and persuade people that they're telling the truth. Now, obviously, our state is not going to institute such a thing, but in the US, the Democrats have started to set up a similar program with interesting web-based tools for spotting fake news. And I would like to see a global coalition being built around that initiative, so that it's picked up in countries all over the world. But I also think, you know, there were some things that Labour got right, and the idea of building a political community through the Labour grassroots, through Momentum, it had its moments of really beginning to turn into something very big. Now, obviously, there was a lot of infighting, there was a lot of trouble, and you know, leadership wasn't great. There were a lot of problems within Labour, but the way in which it built, learning from the Bernie Sanders campaign the first time round in the US, building on this sort of rules for revolutionaries approach, this way of creating these dendritic networks of activists who take on many of the roles that staffers would formerly do in political parties. That was a real step forward and something which can be built on, I think, quite effectively. There's a lot we can still do. There's a lot we can learn, but we have to counter fake news. That's an absolutely essential part of the story.
Thank you. Thank you. Great question. So I'm going to...
remember the one at the top?
We're coming up there, yes.
Should...
Have you got the microphone? Here we go. Thank you. I appreciate your heckling. It's encouragement. So we're just bringing the microphone. There was somebody, it was behind the two of you at the same time were asking a question. I think it was about 2 rows back from the person before that had the question.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. So this leads on a bit from what you were saying about, George, the need for deep investigation. How do we manage the balance between individually taking on that investigation and the fear and anxiety that brings about? because personally, for me, I find that very difficult, and I'm sure I'm not alone.
Well, you're certainly not alone, and I have to say that, you know, I've been pretty robust for most of these 35 years, being able to compartmentalize things and say, right, this is my work, then after work I'll go sea kayaking or I'll go bird watching or something, and I'll leave it behind. And I have to admit, I'm finding that harder and harder to do. Not least because the things that I love and the things I do to get away from work bear all the scars of the things that I'm writing about. Because, you know, the natural world is, you know, where I belong. It's where I feel at home. And everywhere I go now, I just see degradation, depletion happening faster than I ever believed possible. Things that I feared my grandchildren might see, I'm seeing in my own lifetime. And it is getting to me. I would be deceiving you if I were to pretend it wasn't. And, you know, I have a duty to roll in the shit of humanity. That's my work. And it's harder and harder to discharge, I have to say. So, you know, I deliberately look for the hope. I deliberately look for what we can do, how we can turn things around. And there always is hope. There are always things that we can do. But I'm also horribly aware of time's winged chariot hurrying near. And it seems to be accelerating. We do face the real prospect now of systemic collapse. People, you know, there's always a tendency to compartmentalize issues. So we say, you know, I'm concerned about climate breakdown, or I'm concerned about marine ecosystems, or I'm concerned about the soil. But of course, nature and earth systems don't compartmentalize those things. They are all connected, and the earth as a complex system is constantly trying to seek a stable state. That's what complex systems do. And if they're knocked out of one stable state, they will seek a stable state somewhere else. And what we see is the signs of the system seeking to flip from one state to another. And flit from a state that has been habitable by definition for the species which currently inhabit the earth, to one that, again, almost by definition, becomes uninhabitable for perhaps the majority of those species, and possibly including ourselves. And so the notion that, you know, we're not just dealing with elements of the issue, of the problem, we're dealing with something systemic and something huge, and that we might have left it too late, is there all the time. It's undeniable. I mean, people ask me if I'm a pessimist or an optimist, and I reply that I'm pessimistic about what we do, but optimistic about who we are. Because I know we don't want this. The vast majority of people on Earth don't want this. We're like the bank. You know, it can happen that everybody on Earth doesn't want something to happen, but still it happens because there are these forces driving us collectively towards that thing. But because I know that we don't want this, and I know that if we can mobilize the power of persuasion to actually encourage most people to get off their backsides and show that they don't want it, I still believe that we can turn most of this, at any rate, around. But I know that time is just getting shorter and shorter, and yeah, I fear. I suffer from anxiety now. I'd never used to. I wake up in the night, I have nightmares. I have this repeated nightmare of refugees trying to escape from this grey desert and being beaten back by border guards. And you know how you wake up from a nightmare and think, oh, thank God, it was just a nightmare. That doesn't happen. I wake up and think that's already happening. And this could just happen more and more to more and more of the world's people. You know, this is real. This is actually happening. And it troubles me that to the extent that sometimes I dread going to sleep in case I have that nightmare again. So I think in answer to the question, we have to accept that if we're going to take action, we take on that burden. We take on the burden of fear and anxiety. And the way we cope with it is by sharing it, is by recognizing that we're not facing that alone, we are facing that together. And together we can face things that we can't face alone. That's part of our human makeup, that we are much better doing things together than we are alone. And so, you know, the advice for anyone wanting to act is just never act alone. Always work with others for your own psychological health, quite aside from your efficacy.
Thank you. It's so important to have this conversation, and actually really refreshing. I don't think even yet we have it enough where we're honest about the fact that it might not all work out okay, and actually the shit might really hit the fan quicker than we think it might, and it's hard to carry that through. With my corporate talks, generally in the briefing call, they'll generally say to me, just want to check that it's, you know, overall it's going to be positive, isn't it? I mean, overall, they're going to go away and they're going to feel like, thank you, noted, I'll come to you afterwards. Overall, you know, staff are going to go away feeling optimistic and like there's something we can do about that. And I think it's important to have those honest conversations. I know when I wrote my book, after doing the education and the research part, I had what I would call my first sort of depression. I'm naturally very optimistic and bouncy, but you can't not feel those things if you really are human. When you see the scale of ecological collapse and loss and the effects of that on the planet, you can't not feel. So absolutely feeling those feelings, being honest about them, communicating them to each other, to our loved ones, and like George says, being together when we do that. Thank you. So we've got about, I'm looking at your watch, I think we've got about just over 10 minutes left for more questions. So I'm going to come over here and take a question. There's two of you right next to you. Do you have the same question? No. Ooh. Well, I'm going to take both of your questions at the same time. And we'll try and just sort of answer them a little bit more succinctly. Is that okay?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. I really appreciate your talk. You're speaking to many of the concerns that I have, because we're both part of UKJP, so at the end of August, we're organizing a student conference on climate change. But I think, to me, the weakest part of your argument is when you said that for every $100 and something, just one goes to the bottom 10%. And it would seem to me that you're extrapolating present trends into the future and framing something as a problem of consumerism and capitalism when it's a problem of distribution. So my question to you is that I'm not confident in the strength of that argument towards people that are already experiencing a degree of material wealth like we are, when some people are very deprived. And how can we possibly achieve social justice without a level of economic growth and distribution? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your thought-provoking talk. So my question is that you described the need of reconstruction of ideologies like capitalism, constructionism, and neo-liberalism. But besides from the wider systematic change, as well as the individual efforts of a behavioral change, I think cultural and normative change is one of the biggest challenges that we face. So, for example, like people often become defensive and resistant to change their preference and values and beliefs that are socially embedded. So how can we tackle that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Two excellent questions again. So, yes, I mean, the first question, you're right. in principle, at any rate, it doesn't have to be like that. There have been more and less distributive phases of capitalism, with the Trente Glorieuses, as the French call it, 1945 to 1975, being a far more distributive phase of capitalism than we have at the moment. The neoliberal phase is anything but distributive, and it greatly concentrates wealth. So you could say, well, yeah, maybe the trend could be changed. Maybe it doesn't take $111 of growth to generate $1 for the poorest 10%. Maybe it would only take $10 of growth to do that. Even $10 of growth pushes us further towards the brink. And so the question I would ask is, well, why is it growth which is seen as that mechanism for raising up people who have too little? And can capitalism in any form actually meet the needs of the poor without trashing the living planet on which the needs of poor and rich and everybody are entirely dependent? And I believe, and I may be wrong, but I believe for the reasons I put forward that it can't, that it's actually inherently destined to trash our lives and to trash the life on Earth on which we depend. Yes, absolutely, we want to distribute wealth much better than it's currently distributed, but I believe we need a different economic system for that to take place. And you're right, it's a major flaw in the argument because I don't have a complete picture of what that economic system looks like. But it's certainly far more distributive than the system that we have at present. On the question of social and cultural norms, absolutely you were right. And in fact, we constantly neglect this at our peril. I mean, this is why I came here to talk about ideology, because, of course, that is setting social and cultural norms. But, of course, it's not confined to the question of ideology. There's all sorts of other ways in which we embed damaging behavior and damaging notions through culture and through social norms which aren't necessarily directly ideological. And there, I mean, I see great hope there, actually, because I think there are incredible new means of expression being discovered, particularly by younger generations who are just finding ways of sort of breaking the rather stifling thought patterns and stifling social and cultural contracts of people of my age and all others in the second bloom of youth. And
okay, boomer.
Yeah, okay, boomer. Yeah. And so, I mean, I do see hope there. I really do see hope. I mean, the proliferation of new cultural forces, of new media, whether it's within music, within video, this fantastic explosion of different ways of looking at the world. I think there's real hope to be found there, and so let's just keep exploring those things.
Thank you both. So maybe up towards the back here, frantic hand waving, and everyone's pointing to the same person. Can we have a microphone? If there was more than one of you with your hands up, or you weren't all waving at the same person, I think there might be two of you.
Thank you very much. If we thought of the vision happening, this amazing world where we, share resources, we have this amazing, new political and economic structure, when I dream of that, I always come unstuck at this point of work and what is our purpose, especially now that we've moved away from traditional communities, so we no longer have that kind of framework, and because of that, our cities have, our settlements have changed into cities, and we no longer live in these lovely little pathways and communities. So in patterning Patterning Instinct, he talks about, we can't just meet our physical needs. As humans, we're looking for purpose. That is part of us. We need meaning, we need purpose. So how does work come into this? And I have a lot of hope for the kind of volunteer society, but can that be viable? And are we still need some stuff, so how does that work?
Thank you. Another great question. Yeah, I mean, among all the other crises which we could discuss, we could discuss the pension crisis, which of course is intimately associated with work, and we could discuss automation, where so many jobs are either going altogether or being degraded. So they're no longer interesting, rounded jobs, but they're just fragments of jobs that existed before. We could also discuss the idea that neoliberalism turns every good job into a bad job because it's all about quantification and monitoring. So, in the old days, someone would love to be a doctor. I want to be a doctor. Everyone wanted to be a doctor. And now a doctor's job is just endless paperwork. You want to be a teacher, endless paperwork. You want to do anything worthwhile, endless paperwork. Because it's all this assessment and quantification and monitoring and stuff, most of which is just nonsense. It's pointless. As David Graeber says, it's even good jobs become bullshit jobs because 50% of it becomes bullshit. And that's that sort of horrible thought that something which could have been a really satisfying and good job where you knew you were spending the majority of your time actively doing good in the world turns into a job which is both dissatisfying and probably counterproductive. So one of the big mistakes, I think, of previous radical political movements was the extent to which they were pegged to labour. The labour movement, as the name suggests, was very much built around the industrial workforce. Now, it's worth pointing out that even at the height of the industrial workforce, when there were more people employed in large industries and mining than at any other point in history, there were still more women employed in domestic service than in those industries. And yet they weren't represented by that movement. They weren't sort of part of that because it was so based around the industrial workforce. What about people who weren't working at all? Even though it's a lot more inclusive than the political systems that went before it, it was still quite exclusive. And now the idea of building your politics around the workplace, when so many people are sort of fake freelancing in the gig economy, when so many jobs have been torn apart, when you're hot desking, you don't have the stable workforce, you don't have those stable relations with colleagues. I mean, it's just, you can't do it. It's not a viable way of building a political movement. But nor is it going to be the central focus of meaning and purpose in our lives when so many of those jobs have been turned into quite horrible jobs. If people attach their identity to them, then they're going to get really unhappy. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of people. So volunteering, I think, is going to be part of this. I think it's quite an important part because that does offer meaning, purpose, and social connection. It's one of the most effective ways of overcoming loneliness, incidentally, is to volunteer. There's quite a lot of research work done on this. And while it isn't going to put food on the table, in terms of generating meaning, purpose, utility, doing good, the rest of it, it ticks a lot of those elements that I mentioned as being tending towards a meaningful and purposeful life. But at the same time, we should expand our notion of what work is and to sort of break out of that awful trap which says, that ideological framing which says work is something you leave the house to do and get paid for. There are four major pillars of the economy. There's the market and there's the state, and everybody talks about the market and the state. But then there's the household, which some people call the core economy. Catherine Marcel wrote a wonderful book called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? And she points out that while the great man was writing the Wealth of Nations, his long-suffering mother, Margaret Douglas, was doing all the actual work. And that if it weren't for her invisible hands, he would not have been able to complete his book. And yet he completely failed to recognize the work of her and people like her in describing how the economy functioned. And then there's the commons, the fourth pillar, the most neglected pillar of all, which is where communities manage assets together for the general benefit of that particular community. And it's one we've greatly neglected, and I think it's where a lot of our value and sustenance could once again come from. So I think we need radically to redefine what work is in the 21st century, but we also need to find radical new means of distribution, and the commons, I believe, is one of them, and this goes back to the question I answered so badly before. The commons is a way of distributing wealth, because a commons consists of three elements. There's a particular resource, there's a community that manages the resource, and there's the rules and negotiations the community creates to manage the resource. And that resource is either itself divided equally among the members, or the product of that resource is divided equally among the members. The resource exists in perpetuity. It can't be sold, it can't be given away, it should not be degraded. And so it's inherently more sustainable than the market economy. And people like David Bollier and Silke Helfrich, who wrote a book called Free, Fair and Alive, that sort of thinking, I think, holds some of the keys. And in fact, perhaps in the main talk, I should have mentioned this as a big part of the answer, I think, a shift towards the commons economy.
Do you talk about that in Out of the Wreckage?
I do a bit, yeah.
So one of George's books, which is on sale this evening.
In a totally non-capitalist way.
So I think you go into that more, don't you, in the book?
I do a bit, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we are done, I'm afraid, for question times. All that remains is for us to share a few final thoughts with you, some thank yous, a few events that are coming up, but thank you first of all for your fantastic questions. I've loved personally just being able to unpick some of the things that you talked about in your talk, and other subjects have come to the foreground. So thank you for bringing your attention and your questions and your thoughts this evening.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you all. And I'm sorry we didn't get through more questions. It's me yabbering on as usual, so we had an hour and a half and answered about 7 questions, so apologies for that. But
we covered a lot of ground.
We covered a lot of ground, it's true.
I feel sated. I hope you do too.
Thanks. I think what I'd like you to take away is find the hope. I know it's often hard to find, and it's very easy to find the despair. The despair is everywhere to be seen. But even if you have to fake it to make it, find the hope, because there is always hope. Everywhere there is hope. And in trying to engage in any campaign, and in trying to engage anyone else in any campaign, an ounce of hope is worth a ton of despair.
Yeah.
And yes, by all means, we need to describe the world as it is. We need to acknowledge our fear. We need to acknowledge our anxiety. We need to acknowledge our despair. All those things are real, and all those things are justified. But we're not going to go anywhere unless we can also acknowledge the hope. And however difficult situations seem, there's always some hope to be found. So, before anything else, in whatever campaign you're in, whatever area of life you're in, look for the hope, find it, emphasize it, put that up in front of you as the star that you're walking towards, and keep walking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Natalie.
Thank you. Stand up.
Sorry, yeah.
Mwah. Thank you, George. Thank you. Before you go, I just want to let you know of a few events that are coming up in London. We've got the London Climate Change Festival, which is running for 8 weeks from the end of March, starting on the 23rd of March. If you want to hear George again, he'll be in Bristol on the 12th of March. We'll be doing another run of this, going into some more questions. Again, you can follow Fraser on social media, myself, Natalie Fee, George on Twitter if you're not already. And thank you for staying around for the thanks. I know everyone just wants to get home at this point, but I really do want to say thank you to the people that made this possible this evening. So thank you to, first of all, Gillian Lynn Theatre for having us and your amazing staff and tech. We thank you very much. To Primrose Hill Books, who've come out at last minute to sell some of my books and George's books. Thank you to, oh, you don't have to clap everyone, but that's very generous of you. The Resurgence team, who've come and offered up free copies of their magazine and supported the event on social media. To Fraser Anderson and his amazing music. And Bex, his team, thank you so much for bringing your gorgeous presence and music to us. To Angelfish Films, Dobby, for putting this event on. Without him, none of this would be happening. And all the lovely volunteers that have helped support the evening tonight. And finally, just one more thanks to George Monbiot for bringing his incredible inspiration. Thank you all for coming. Have a safe journey home. And find that hope wherever you go. Thank you.